Hi, everybody. We are back in office hours. I wanted to take a little bit of time to circle back to our discussion of market power. Here are two diagrams for the last video where we just did a little bit of review of what was covered in class session 2. But we were talking about the nature of a pure product monopoly, and we suggested that there may not exist within a particular product space a complete unique product monopoly. However, the left diagram illustrates an important point in that we can think about monopolies from the perspective of lack of choice on the consumer side. In the diagram on the left, you'll notice in Minneapolis here, it looks like there are a significant number of people that only have access to either Comcast or Charter with no alternative competitors, implying that over these consumers in the purple region, Comcast has a monopoly, and over the consumers in the orange region, Charter has a monopoly for broadband service. The right diagram is again indicative of some concentration of market power. We have a bunch of banks that are consolidating, that are merging into what are known as the Big Four, which account for, I think, more than 50% of the market share deposits now at this point. So again, both instances are describing to us cases where we have concentration of market power amongst fewer firms. And the general lesson that we saw last time is that when this happens, the firms tend to increase prices, reduce trade. This gives the firms a bigger cut of the economic pie, but it does cause an efficiency loss and shrinks it, mostly at the expense of consumers. What we want to touch on in this particular set of videos is how we would go about measuring the extent to which a firm can wield market power, or equivalently, maybe thinking about the problem of to what degree is an industry subject to monopolization, to the concentration of market power. And we typically take three approaches. We're going to look specifically at two here today. We're going to look at a performance metric approach and a structural metric approach. But approach number one, which we're actually going to end with here, is to look at structural characteristics of the industry to characterize the degree of the concentration of market power, also known as market concentration. So imagine that we were able to count the number of firms in a particular market or in a particular industry, and we could measure the market shares of each firm's output. If we knew that, then we would be able to describe how the distribution of the market shares is spread out amongst the firms. For example, if we're a monopoly, there's one firm with 100% market share. Okay? If we're in perfect competition, we have almost an infinite number of firms, each with negligible market share. Second approach is we could look at the conduct of the industry and ask questions like, are firms potentially colluding, which is illegal? Are they explicitly colluding, rather, by trying to either fix prices or restrict output in ways that would adversely affect an industry? Is the government playing a role in facilitating barriers to entry or subsidies that potentially influences a firm's position in the market? We're not going to look too much at the conduct argument yet until we get back to game theory and thinking about the problem a cartel faces. But we will take a look at approach 3 today in thinking about looking at the market performance. Okay, we know perfect competition is kind of this extreme case where firms exhibit zero market power. And in that situation, the market price reflected exactly the marginal cost of the good in equilibrium, and meaning that prices provided an accurate signal of the production cost in a competitive market, which was one of the attractive features of the competitive market equilibrium. The prices were accurate signals of the cost of production in equilibrium. This meant that in perfect competition, firms were not marking up the price of the good in equilibrium. The last unit they produced, the price was exactly equal to the marginal cost. So one thing we could think about doing is measuring how far is price from marginal cost. If the answer is they're the same, then that outcome is consistent with perfect competition. However, if the price is bigger than marginal cost, then this is evidence that we've departed from that end of the market spectrum. Okay, so these three approaches, structure, conduct, and performance, this is often referred to as the SCP paradigm, or the structure, conduct, performance paradigm, which is actually implemented by the Department of Justice when thinking about evaluating mergers and acquisitions. There are two types of mergers. We have vertical mergers, where you can think about two firms merging within the supply chain. So a manufacturer potentially absorbs a retailer or vice versa. We could also have what's known as a horizontal merger, where one competitor acquires another horizontally across the supply chains, not within a supply chain. The Department of Antitrust and the FTC as well tend to keep a close watch on mergers and generally make sure that the resulting merger would not have adverse effects on consumers. We're going to take a look, as I mentioned before, at a performance metric and structural metric approach used in antitrust analysis. Okay, the first metric we're going to look at, we're actually going to start with approach 3. We're going to start with the performance metric. We're going to look at something known as the Lerner Index, or Lerner's Index. And again, this performance metric is really predicated on the idea that in the perfectly competitive market equilibrium, the price in equilibrium equaled the marginal cost of production. Okay. In a monopoly outcome, however, the profit-maximizing monopolist wound up setting a price in a profit-maximizing allocation that was exceeding the marginal cost of production. So in the top situation, the price is a good reflection of the production cost, but in the bottom situation, the price is kind of contaminated with market power. It floats up a little bit too much because the presence of market power drives the ability of the firm to move the price up away from marginal cost, implying that the firm in a monopoly situation is essentially employing a markup. They're getting the good at some cost, they're turning around and selling it at a price higher than that cost with respect to the equilibrium quantity. So again, in the equilibrium and perfect competition in the left side here, price equals marginal cost, and the price is an accurate reflection of the cost. In the monopoly outcome, however, the price is distorted above the actual production cost at the margin, and the firm is able to engage in charging a markup above cost in equilibrium on that equilibrium unit. So what we're going to do is think about measuring the size of the markup, okay, and that's just the price minus the marginal cost. And the argument's going to be that the presence of a markup is evidence that we've departed from the competitive market outcome in which in equilibrium there would have been no markup. The price would have equaled marginal cost of production in equilibrium. So the idea here is we're going to measure the size of the markup, and the bigger it is, the more market power the firm is wielding, or rather, the farther away we are from the perfectly competitive market outcome of having no markup. So all we're going to do is measure the size of the markup, and we're going to do it in kind of a strange way. Normally, when you think about measuring markup, you think about it as a percentage of the cost. We're going to do something a little bit different today, and we're going to measure the markup as a percentage of the price charged. Okay, and this will maybe make you a little angry from the consumer's perspective, because when you think about it this way, it turns out we're measuring the markup in a way that's measuring to the extent you're almost getting not ripped off, but the extent to which the price you pay doesn't actually have very much to do with the cost of actually producing the good. So the way we are going to measure the markup, also known as the Lerner Index, is we're going to measure the markup in the numerator, the price above the marginal cost, but instead of dividing by the marginal cost, we're going to measure as a fraction of the price. Okay, so just to kind of think about an illustrative example here, let's suppose we purchased 1 unit of a good. The total price of the good is $100, but the marginal cost of the good is only $30, meaning to produce this good, it costs the seller $30, but they're able to tack on another 70 and sell it to me for 100. Okay, so if we calculated the Lerner Index, the price I would plug in would be 100 for P, and then I would plug in 30 for the marginal cost, And you can see when you do this calculation, the value you get for L is 0.7 or 70%. And the way you can kind of interpret this is for this particular marginal unit, okay, we can think about 70% of the price paid as being completely unrelated to what it actually cost to produce the good. So what is explaining that 70%? Well, if the market was perfectly competitive, this good would have been sold at marginal cost at a price of 30. So the extra $70 is there because we are departing from the competitive outcome. So that markup, that 70% that I'm paying for, which has nothing to do with actually producing the good, that is evidence that we've moved away from the competitive market outcome. Again, if the market was perfectly competitive, price would equal marginal cost and equilibrium on that unit, and the Lerner index would be 0. Okay, the price would equal marginal cost. So just a general rule of thumb here, the closer the Lerner index is to 0, the more consistent the market outcome is with the competitive market outcome, where the firms wind up pricing at marginal cost. On the other hand, the closer the Lerner index is to 1. And if you think about 1, that means 100% of the price that you paid had nothing to do with the cost. So it's like the firm had 0 cost and all of the price is attributed to market power. So if the Lerner index is close to 1, that's the highest it can be actually. The highest, the largest percentage of the price you can pay is all of it. So the closer the Lerner index is to 100% or to 1, the further away the market outcome is from the competitive market outcome, again, evidencing the presence of market power. Now, we have to be careful. If the Lerner index is 1, it doesn't necessarily mean I'm in a monopoly, because the monopoly has to do with the structure of the industry. How many firms are there, and what's the market share? Okay, monopoly, there's one firm with 100% market share. Okay, the Lerner index, again, is a performance metric. It's measuring a market outcome. And just because the Lerner index is 1, it doesn't mean we're necessarily in the market structure of a monopoly. It means the outcome is extremely far away from perfect competition. Okay, so closer to 0, closer to perfect competition. Closer to 1, then the outcome is farther away from perfect competition, and we have some market power, evidence of market power being accrued in the hands of the firms. Okay, I'm going to show you some data from 2 studies. First study is Hall in 1988, a little bit of an older study, and this is an econometric study, meaning they use some statistical models to estimate the cost functions of the firms, to estimate the technologies. And then what they did is they computed an industry-weighted average Lerner index by calculating the Lerner index for each firm in the industry, weighting that by the relative market shares, and computing an industry Lerner index. So here are actual values of Lerner indices that were computed in this study by Hall in 1988. Okay, note there, the Lerner index should be between 0 and 1. And there's a couple values that might pop out at you. If you look at communication, you'll notice the Lerner index is really close to 1, which probably makes sense. You know, communication industries, telecoms, we know there's few firms, really high fixed cost, high barrier entry industry, and they do wield quite a bit of market power over consumers, especially consumers that have no choice. So one way you can interpret that Lerner index is if you assume that the cost of production was constant, like constant marginal or average cost, then the way to interpret that is about 97% of what you're paying for communication services has nothing to do with the cost of production. Okay, so only about 2.8% of the price you pay is really covering the cost of production. Again, if we're abusing here the assumption that maybe the cost is constant. Other number that might pop out at you, okay, textile mill products. It looks like that Lerner index is negative. Well, I thought, Steve, you said that the Lerner index had to be between 0 and 1. I did mention that, but the thing to remember is we do not really have any information about the government conduct in the industry here. This is a performance metric. Okay, and one thing that we need to be aware of is the conduct of the government in the textile industry. Textiles are highly subsidized. It's a highly subsidized industry. And this allows firms to actually price below marginal cost. If you're wondering how is it possible we get a negative Lerner index, it's because the price is below marginal cost, implying that the firm, why would they do that? Well, they're receiving a subsidy. Okay. So you can take that in for what it is, give you an idea of where you're maybe getting likely to be getting price gouged versus where you're maybe facing more of a competitive market. I'm going to look at another study, Doppelbar from 2004. They do something very similar. They use a slightly different statistical technique, which is why the Lerner indexes look significantly lower in the right study. So the proper comparison here is not between the left and the right columns, but within a particular column. So if you look at the Doppelbar 2004 study, again, there's an important industry to take note of here, and that is milk and dairy. Okay, agriculture is, again, an extremely highly subsidized industry in the United States. So it's no surprise here that the Lerner index is fairly low. And this is, again, where we have to be careful. The Lerner index is a performance metric. Okay, a Lerner index of 0 does not necessarily mean the market is competitive. It means that the market outcome is consistent with perfect competition. Okay, so milk and dairy is absolutely not a perfectly competitive market, but it is one where, again, firms are receiving subsidies that allows them to price as if they were a perfectly competitive market. So again, this is the Lerner index. It is a performance metric. The other metric I wanted to discuss here, which is also applied in antitrust analysis, is a measure of market concentration, also known as a structural metric. And this metric is called the HHI, which is short for the Herfindahl-Hirschman Index, which is quite a mouthful. So I'm just going to call it the HHI. And this is essentially an index that summarizes the distribution of market shares across firms in a particular industry. In order to compute and utilize the index, it does require practitioners to be able to define clearly which firms are actually in the industry. So there really needs to be a clear market definition to apply this concept. It also requires practitioners to be able to calculate the market shares of each firm. This can be difficult when firms are providing services instead of goods, where maybe the output is difficult to measure. So I want to discuss how to compute the HHI as if we had a clear market definition and as if we had the market share information of firms. Okay, so the way we're going to compute the HHI, which again is a measure of market concentration, is a measure of structure, not performance, not the market outcome, but it's a measure of what does the market look like in terms of the number of sellers and the distribution of market share across these sellers. Okay, so I'm going to define here S sub I as the market share of output for firm I. So if market I produces half of the output in the industry, then firm I's share rather would be equal to 50%. Okay, if there are N firms in the industry, then the HHI is computed by squaring each firm's market share and then adding them all up. Okay, and we're going to do something kind of weird. The market shares are percentages, but we're going to just write them like integers. So instead of writing 100 as 1.00, okay, we're just going to write 100% as 100. Okay, so the way we compute the HHI is as follows. We take each firm's market share, we square it, and then we add them all up. And I think the best way to understand the HHI is to go through just a few examples. We're going to go through 3 cases. Okay, for case 1, let's consider a case where there's a pure monopoly, meaning the number of firms in the industry are going to be 1, and the market share of the only firm is going to be 100. In this case, the HHI is just 100 squared, which is 10,000, and this is the largest possible value that the HHI can take. Okay, so the largest it can be is 10,000. That corresponds to a pure monopoly. At the other extreme end of the spectrum, we can think about a perfectly competitive market where we have a continuum of infinitely many firms in the market, such that each firm is essentially atomistic, a grain of sand in an infinitely vast desert. So, and this implies that the market share of each firm is really close to zero. So in this case, we would be adding up the market shares of like an infinite number of firms, but all of their market shares are zero. So when we do that, the HHI's value adding up a bunch of zero squares is going to be zero, and this is the smallest value of the index. Okay, so the logic with the HHI is the closer it is to 10,000, the more the market looks like a monopoly. The closer it is to zero, the more the market structure looks like perfect competition. If you wanted to consider an intermediate case, let's suppose we had a market with 5 equally sized firms, identical in terms of their market shares, meaning if there's 5 of them, each one has 20% in the case where they are all identical. So to calculate the HHI, again, we're going to add up for each firm the market shares squared. So we got 5 terms, 20 squared, 20 squared, 20 squared, 20 squared, 20 squared. 20 squared is 400. 400 times 5 gives us an HHI of exactly 2,000. Okay, so 2,000, if you see that value, you can think, well, that's consistent with the case where we had 5 equally sized firms, but there are many other cases that could also yield an HHI of 2,000 if the firms were not, say, symmetric in their distribution of market shares. Now, the way that the antitrust division utilizes the HHI to evaluate horizontal mergers involves sort of a 3-case treatment here. Okay? And in order to apply the 3-case treatment, we need to know not only the HHI before and after the proposed merger, which requires us to somehow forecast some expectation of how market shares change, but we also need to know how much the HHI changes from a particular merger. If it changes too much, that could be as much of a warning sign as just a high value is initially. Okay, so scenario 1, if the merger causes the HHI after the firms merge to be smaller than 1,000, okay, then typically these mergers are presumed to raise no competitive concerns except in exceptional circumstances. So if the post-merger HHI is smaller than 1,000, more than likely the Department of Justice is not going to try to block the merger. However, if post-merger the HHI is somewhere between 1,000 and 1,800. Now, 1,800 is pretty close to 2,000. Remember, 2,000 corresponded to 5 equally sized firms. So the case where the HHI is at 1,800 is somewhere kind of between 6 and 5 equally sized firms in the industry. If the post-merger HHI is between 1,000 and 1,800, then the DOJ is going to look at how much the HHI had changed. If the change wasn't that large, then the merger is not likely to be challenged. Okay. However, if the change in the HHI is sufficiently big, when the post-merger value is between 1,000 and 1,800, then the merger does raise potentially anti-competitive concerns. And the typical process here is the litigants would consider other market factors and further analysis. Scenario 3 occurs when the post-merger HHI kind of puts us in a danger zone where it's above 1,800. Okay, remember, above 1,800 means we're dealing with like a situation where we have fewer than 6 equally sized firms in the industry. If this is the scenario, then we kind of have a 3-case breakdown within situation 3. If the HHI's change is really, really small, meaning maybe 2 tiny firms merge together, not 2 big firms, then we're not really too concerned. However, if the HHI changes between the values of 50 and 100, okay, then again, the merger does raise some significant concerns, and we would have to consider other market factors. Lastly, if the change in the HHI is over 100, meaning post-merger, the HHI is large, and 2 large firms had probably merged to cause the HHI to change that much. If we're in this particular situation, then the antitrust division typically is going to block the merger. Okay, so this is just kind of a guideline to think about how the antitrust division is evaluating mergers and acquisitions. So if you were thinking about the problem of how to litigate an antitrust case based off of just this measure of market concentration. So if we're defending a firm that is merging, then what we actually want to do as the defense litigation is we want to try to argue that the market's really, really big. And if the market's big, that means we're going to include a lot of firms. And the more firms there are, the lower the market shares are going to look for my firm that is merging. Okay, so we want to try to argue a very broad market definition here to make it look like the market concentration is actually low and market shares are small. On the other side, if we're prosecuting the merger on behalf of the Department of Justice, for example, then the argument's reversed. We want to try and argue that the market definition is very specific. It's very narrow. The narrower the market definition, the fewer firms are going to be in it, which makes each firm inside the narrow market definition look like it is larger, looks more like it is monopolizing. Okay, so if we include less firms in the HHI, this causes the market shares to go up and the market concentration measure to go up, the HHI to go up as well. Okay, so from the litigation standpoint, the wiggle room here is really how do you argue the market definition? Okay, how do we know two firms are in the same market? If they're not in the same market, then they can merge and it's not necessarily an anti-competitive threat. And the question is really, do firms face competition from each other? If they do and they merge, then they're in the same market. Okay, and the short answer to this, to what extent do firms face competition, is we should look at the degree of substitutability between the products. Okay, for example, we know that Pepsi and Coke are in the same market because when Pepsi changes its price, this affects the demand for Coca-Cola and vice versa. This is one of the first things we discussed when we were looking at demand curve shifters, in that the price of related goods could cause demand to change for a different good. So in terms of thinking about the degree of substitutability, okay, that's really going to be the key. We could think about defining markets with respect to geographical definition. There may be specific goods and services where geographical definition is relevant. But if we're talking about Amazon.com, you could be purchasing anywhere. Geographical definition doesn't really constrain us from being in a market with competitors. Also, the scope of the products. We're all selling very, very similar things. Argument could be that we are in the same market together. But I would argue if we're really in the same market, then it should be the case that our goods are actually substitutes. If our goods are substitutes, then that means we're competing with one another, and that when you change your price, that shows up in affecting my demand. Okay, so one way we can actually capture some statistical evidence of two firms being in the same market is by measuring something known as the cross-price elasticity. Okay, we've discussed the elasticity of demand, which measures the percent change in the quantity of a good with respect to a percent change in that good's own price. But we can also think about the extent to which the demand for a good is sensitive to the price changes of other goods that are related to it. Okay, so if I observe the price of good Y goes up, and as a result, consumers run over and buy more of good X, so that the quantity demanded of good X increases, then I get a positive relationship between those two goods, between the quantity of one good and the price of the other, which is consistent with those two goods being substitutes. And this can be used as evidence to argue statistically that these two goods are in the same market, and implying that the market definition would include those two firms. One firm changes its price, we see the other firm's demand responds to that. That's evidence that we are substitutable products, that we are actually in competition with each other. You changed your price, and that caused buyers to run one way or the other, meaning we are in competition. So I think this is a good place to leave you. We will pick up with more on monopoly and market power momentarily. Happy hunting.